the first tour that Stones ever did was behind the Everly Brothers, several steps down the bill, by the way. They'd had exactly one single, Come On, by Chuck Berry. They had not toured. They had not been in front of any large audiences. They're touring behind the Everlys and watching both Jagger and Richard, so we're just watching everything they do from the stage and the other, and I'm watching. And that was the first time that Keith Richard realized that American roots artists use tunings. I mean, they learned a lot from Ry Cooder later. That's well talked about. But the fact that they didn't know that one of the reasons this happened, this is a recurring story. You get all these big 60s bands, and when they finally get in the room, he said, now will you show me how to play Bye Bye Love? We know we're doing it wrong. And he would show them that, and they say, oh, geez, that's that. Yeah, they didn't know. I mean, they had learned it from blues players when they were little kids in Chicago. I mean, it was part of what they knew, and it was instinctive by that point. But so you put this together, these slamming chords. Richards would say later, he said, that's why it was so hard, because people don't think about it. This was slamming heavy chords they were doing. It's intros to songs, and between them, and we all picked up on this. He said, they were doing it with acoustic guitars. I said, it's really hard on the hands. It's really hard on the life. He said, it's very hard to do. And they never stopped. I mean, that's one of the jokes. I mean, they brought in that element to certainly a vast part of rock and roll. This thing of sing in harmony, as we said, like they had done with the Crickets, in front of this slamming chord band, was a picture of the future. And when people label them as rockabilly, they're missing a point, which is our idea of rockabilly is sort of the Carl Perkins or even Elvis pattern, which is what? Which is that you sing more or less R&B style. You might be your turn on it, or it might be an outright imitation. And then you do country picking with it. And then they call that rockabilly. Well, the Everlys had introduced exactly the opposite, which was closed country harmonies applied to these songs on other subjects, with slamming guitar, with blues bass, and then a blues bass, R&B guitar behind it. And that is a contribution to music which never went away. The Musicians Hall of Fame eventually recognized Don for introducing this stuff. The musicians knew, but a lot of people had no idea that that was part of their continuing legacy, and it very much is. I think sometimes people don't quite grasp the size that the Everlys were during, the 5-6 year period that you get if you're lucky. I mean, in some ways, that's all the Beatles got. If you add it up, wait a minute, that's sort of 64 to 70 or 63 to 70. That was it. And then after that, it's like every which way, loose. So for the Everlys, it was also about a 5-year kind of deal of couldn't go wrong, really. And in that time, I mean, people who were their age or younger are picking it up on everything they do. The guys who became the Beatles, for instance, since we've been mentioning them, didn't have a rhythm section even at that point. I mean, there was 3 guys with guitars. They got a drummer because they needed Pete Best's mother's house as a rehearsal space. They hadn't really got it together. But they saw this, and every Everly's record that came out, they would put into their live show, including something like Kathy's Clown. So in America and in England, these people who were going to be the heart of a lot of the music just ahead in the 60s, after 1963, basically, are all coming to the shows. They're all studying the records. In America, it meant the people who became Simon and Garfunkel were doing these Tom and Jerry hits, which got them on Bandstand. They sold one, which is pure Everly's imitation. They'd be the first one to tell you. When they were in high school, they were very young, and they got a beginning of a career out of it and writing songs as Everly acolytes, to be polite about it. They were first to admit that's what we were doing at that age. But there were other people that are less obvious. The Fogerty brothers were hearing this, and And if you've heard John Fogerty do When Will I Be Loved 4 million times, it started when the record first came out, before there was Creedence. The Beach Boys. Well, there's differences between the Beach Boys and the Everly's harmony. The main one being all the harmony that the Everleys learned was a combination of outright white country. This is like they wanted to be the Delmore Brothers, and and that was like country boogie of that time, and a few other groups that were doing that kind of boogie at the time that people won't know as well. And their father had, from the Songs Our Daddies Told Us record, people think they were all learning old country. Well, a lot of that country there's not that old, first of all. Some of it is. I mean, Barbara Allen is 4 million years old, and people lock in their heads that it's not all that record was either. But Ike had taught them just as much. I remember he hadn't really come to people's attention doing country music. He was known for blues and ragtime and fancy picking in Muhlenberg County, and got to do country because radio demanded it, and he was no fool. Early morning family radio wanted country, so he learned it. It was like the real Doc Watson story. They want that in this folk revival. He'd been playing rockabilly, so he learned that. Not what people think. They think everybody was on their porch learning songs from their great-grandparents. Not quite the case. But Ike had introduced him just as much as country of their day and before, and especially harmonies of their own day, to the black harmony groups. He was teaching them the Ink Spots and the Mills Brothers, which led directly to them feeling perfectly natural, picking up from the beginning of the R&B doo-wop groups at the beginning of the 50s. Remember, they say, "Oh, we heard that. It didn't seem like it was very different from what we were doing, so we just picked that up too." And this beat thing started to come in what they did. The Beach Boys harmony was derived from white pop groups before them, the Four Freshmen, the Four Aces, which is totally out of the Everleys' wheelhouse. All the white singing they picked up was country music. So there's this fundamental difference, but at the point where it gets close to what folk was understood to be on the edge of the 60s, there was overlap. And the Wilson brothers and their cousins, who were already arguing about many things, did not argue about the Everly brothers. And if you were going to do harmonies with acoustic guitars, of course they knew every song the Everleys put out. And on that first so-called party record they do the Everleys Devoted to You. And eventually they do Don't Worry Baby on a record together years later. So they say, yes, the Everleys matter. Now, this is just on this side of the water. And there's some weird things, like the people who are going to become the Velvet Underground. Now, there's something people don't know. They were, just as Lou was joining that group, the rest of them were listening to those records because of the clarity of the instrumentals that you could tell. And they said we were just like drunk with it. So nobody would figure the Velvet Underground, but in fact, they say so. Now, across the water, every British invasion band was highly aware of this. The Everleys got to be bigger in England than here, and it stuck. They were still having, after that 5 years, they were still having top 10 hits in England. Gone, 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 Love is Strange, things like this, when they didn't do as well here. Never really stopped in England and Europe and other countries. So the bands that people know oh so well are paying a lot of close attention to what they do. They do a show in Manchester when they start actually touring England, and those tours circa 1962, 3, 4, every year were like the old bus tours they were doing in America. So that was like a throwback here by then, but not there. And they've been touring with Sam Cooke and Clyde McPhatter and people like that. And in England now, they're kids. They do a show in Manchester, and afterwards there's a couple kids come up knocking and follow them back to their hotel. Well, it's the Hollies. I mean, it's grand fashion. And how did you play that chord? And the other thing is, we're trying to write songs. Do you think you can do it? And the Everleys took a half hour encouraging them and talking to them, which stuck with them for life, that they would say, you can do this. You can do this. If you work at it, why couldn't you do it? And not too many years later, the Everleys make a record basically with them, with the Hollies, the two Yanks in England album, which was mostly songs written by Hollies, and a few other British songs nobody had heard here yet. In that same tour where the Stones were picking up from what the Everleys were doing live and how they did it, Little Richard was on that tour too, and Bo Diddley was on that tour. There was all one fantastic, probably cost about $3 to see it, but they're on that tour, and Richard been over there the year before, and or months before that, and the Beatles publishing management came to him with this new song and record called "Please Please Me," which had broken in England, but nobody ever heard of it in America. It wasn't out. Nobody knew who they were. Nobody knew if they could sell. And they gave it to him and said, "Do you think you could take this back there and get somebody to record it?" And he listened to it, and he said, and Richard's first response was, "Well, why do we need 4 Everly Brothers? We already got 2." Literally what they owed them, yeah. and those acts. By the way, you never hear anybody saying, "Why did the Everlys step on or cover these black artists' songs?" Those guys, they tended to love it because they would always do it their own way, which was basically what the black artists wanted to see from anybody. Richard was a songwriter. You want other people to record your songs. It's a good thing. The Lucille was, a hit for them and things like this with other bands went on. I mean, Ray Charles recorded "Bye Bye Love" in return, besides what he did for them. So there was very good relations there, and that's why. Yeah, I left one American out, which is going to really be not obvious to people except maybe later. Yeah, there's a kid in Minnesota who paid attention to every single record that they did, and maybe years later when Bob starts to record a couple of "Let It Be Me" and a couple of other "Take a Message to Mary" in 1970. But by then he knew the Everly Brothers. But when he's a kid in Minnesota, everybody's thinking this guy was raised on Woody Guthrie. We know better. He'd been a piano player in Bobby B's band. He knew all the early rock and roll records, and he had studied those for the same reason anybody who wound up in roots music did. Because this is kind of interesting. Look what they're doing there. If you look at his very first album, the one that didn't sell, with all these old blues tunes on it, or the song Highway 51, which the chords on it are "Wake Up Little Susie." And not only are they that, but it says so on the album notes, and nobody paid any attention. He said, "Yeah, that's something I picked up from the Everly Brothers." Years later, they said, "Why'd you do it that way?" He said, "That age? It was a lot easier for me to relate to that than the blues singer they think, I sort of lived and grew up with." I said, that was easier to do. Those same chords, that same dun, 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 dun. Yeah, that's called "It's All Right, Ma, I'm only bleeding." The chords between that, it's "Wake Up Little Susie." He never stopped liking them. In 1969, he came to their shows in New York, offered them "Lay Lady Lay," which there was a lot of confusion. They didn't understand whether he was really offering it. They couldn't understand what he was saying. Famously, they thought he was saying something like, "Lay Lady Lay, lay across my big white breasts," or something. And they said,
he was singing really quiet.
He was singing like Bob, and it was really quiet. He was like bashful about bringing this to them. And they said, like something like, "Well, you could get away with that. We can't." He totally misheard it. Then he was looking at them puzzled. Why would they think that? And they didn't do it. He also offered them the song that became "Wanted Man" with Johnny Cash. It was called like "The Fugitive" then, and they didn't take that either. But Cash and he dickered with Little, and there it came out on San Quentin. but I mean, so they kept doing it. Eventually, they recorded a beautiful version of "Abandoned Love," his song, maybe the best, with Irish pipe backing and all this stuff. That was in the 80s. But and they recorded "Lay Lady Lay" then just to make it good, but it was 15 years later. So that's the Americans, and we've not run out of all the Brits. I mean, obviously the Beatles. There were shows. The show in Liverpool in their first English tour, George Harrison is in the crowd. It happens that Lennon and McCartney are like on vacation someplace and didn't hear it then. They were also on the same TV show after they first hit. It was like Top of the Pops or something in England. The Everlys are on there live still because they never stopped being big in England. They could tour there constantly and were treated like rock gods. I mean, it was Everly Mania. There's a record called The Brit Everly Sound that has 35 English records from that period that are imitating the Everleys. And they're from different groups. I mean, so nobody called it Everly Mania, but it was before there was Beatlemania. And in 1970, country rock has scored, and they've come back with songs like Bowling Green, and they're doing the Roots album, and people are, it's clear that what they'd done mattered to people again. People were doing things that sound like them. Don sits down with Graham Parsons and shows them how to do the chords and the harmonies on those Brian songs. And if you look, you notice that Don wrote the liner notes for the International Submarine Band album. He said, listen to this. Country matters in this stuff as well as the R&B. So it was that close, and it was very influential album like Sweetheart of the Rodeo, about the same time. And they got a primetime TV show, the Johnny Cash Summer Replacement Show. And it's wonderful. I got to see it under penalty of death to show it to anybody during the writing of this book, because there's all kinds of hang-ups with it. I hope someday people can see the show outright, because there's so much interesting things, songs nobody ever heard. They do a lot of Beatles. Anyway, when they got the show, it's spring 1970. They're about to start filming, videotaping. So Don takes off for England to go see the Beatles to ask if maybe they would come on their show, given everything and their feeling. And McCartney has to tell them, listen, we just broke up. We're not a band anymore. He says, I got this song that might be really good for you guys. It's two of us going nowhere. And it would be like really good. I said, well, eventually people saw in the documentary, so when they were recording, they said, I'm Don, you're Phil. I mean, they said that. It's like, it was an Everly's type song. And Don said, well, I have something to tell you. We just finished our 10-year contract with Warner Brothers, and we don't have a label right now, which they were going to again shortly. So perfect timing. Oh, yeah. So that's why there's no Everly Brothers record. They might have done two of us, but they didn't. Yeah. And they did a lot of Beatles songs on their show. Some of them just beautifully. They wouldn't be outright recordings like they did with everybody else. They would make it their own. And there's, I hope people get to hear more of that and see some of that more, at least hear it. Because you can put a record out of the audio. It's really complicated getting songs off of TV shows. There are episodes of doctor dramas that you never see where they rerun them because there was one song in the background and it's too expensive to deal with. So it's a tough thing. It's also good money if you can get a song on a TV show, but the downside is that. The Everly Brothers and Buddy Holly and the Crickets, the whole band, were very close with Buddy while he was around, and the Crickets right through to the end of like Don's life, the second one to go for years. And I think not everybody's aware of that relationship. But they first met at a concert in Montreal in 1957. They've both hit That'll Be the Day and Bye Bye Love were recorded only a matter of weeks apart. There was a bit of delay in releasing the Crickets record, but by this point, they're in a good stead on the charts. They both realize they're sort of, who are these guys? And they meet each other backstage, and they're immediately taken with each other. And I think one of the reasons we talk about this is, I think people make anything in the arts, but certainly musicians will get this, which is that there's this admiration for the people who do well what you don't. And in the case of these two groups, well, Don and Phil had these immaculate harmonies. And if you think the Crickets were singing harmonies, those were backup singers. They did not all sing on those records. They were amazed by what the locked-in harmonies that the Everleys could do. On the other hand, at that point in the Everleys' life, they had never seen this still very rare thing, which was a band that wrote songs, recorded the songs, took them out live and played them together. This was really rare at that time. And they were saying, that's interesting. So right away they were interested in each other. And, the Everleys who were at that point coming out of Nashville. They'd been grown up and basically in the Midwest, contrary to what people think, in Chicago and Shenandoah, Iowa, then Knoxville, and finally Nashville. And there's not much Kentucky in there, folks. But the Crickets were pure Texas. and there was no question about that, even if they recorded in Clovis. So I think Phil said we met them and they were like us because they had the same thing where they were raised on country music, which was true. I think the extent to which that was true of Buddy and the Crickets, maybe people don't know so well, but they were. That was where they started. And we wanted to do other things. They did, we did. It was expanding what we were thinking about. So in that sense, they would say, like, well, we kind of spoke the same language, except they had this Texas lingo among each other that we didn't always understand in group talk. It was a band, and they were brothers. They met, and they hit it right off. They wound up on some tours, winding up in the same place, but not immediately, because the way those bus tours worked in those days, they would pick who went with who, and this kind of group and this, and they weren't necessarily out there together all the time, but sometimes. And the other thing was about the songwriting thing, which they both realized early on they were doing. Phil and Don's writing was there from the beginning, but it started to really click where they had their own hits, not written by the Bryants or anyone else. They were sort of getting B-sides at first, but the songs were there. And Buddy started sending songs to the Crickets because they were doing well enough, maybe they'll record them. He's working with the Ralph Peer people and they kind of, sell the song. So they were into that. And one of the first songs that he proposed that the Everly Brothers record was Not Fade Away, because they'd already shown they had this Bo Diddley thing. Don would talk about Bo Diddley all the time. He loved him. He said, I wanted to be Hank Williams and Bo Diddley, an unusual, ambition. But there's a modified Bo Diddley beat and riff in a couple of their earliest songs, even Bye Bye Love. He always says it's Bo Diddley, but it's really his own. It's a variation on what he learned from Bo Diddley. But Buddy picked up on this. He says, what about this? And the truth is their publisher didn't really want him to do outside songs. So that didn't happen. Later, after they got to know each other, Buddy wrote 2 more songs for the Everlys, which is Love's Made a Fool of You, another Bo Diddley beat song with a little Latin tinge, and Wishing, which is a perfect Everly's harmony song. And there again, they never recorded them. They did do Not Fade Away many years later, but long after. So they got to be friends. And among other things, Buddy would send all of his new songs through Phil. It was Buddy and Phil that were particularly close. And Phil said, I was amazed. Here's Maybe Baby. These things would come through right to the end. Those famous apartment songs that Buddy left behind when he died. All of those he'd heard. And Don and Phil talked about how at parties at the end, he was just so upset because he wasn't getting a hit. And this is a kind of theme with people who've gotten them. Where'd they go? They like they're never going to end. And he hit what was a cold spot, and he's still writing this great stuff. It can happen. So he was upset they heard these songs. Meanwhile, there's one show where they played together in full. It was a show in Florida. There was a few other people on the bill, like Jerry Lee Lewis. And it was a great show. And it was a one-off. And the Everlys realized there was so much hard rock going on with that lineup that they were afraid they were going to sound, a little soft by comparison. So they said, there's one time we just asked Buddy, step up and play behind us. And they did a whole show that way, just once. Now, the relation with the Crickets was going to go on forever. They're on Everly's records. They're close friends. They wrote songs that the Everlys recorded. But this is over 50 years, we're talking about months, and Buddy's still around from 58 to the beginning of 60. There's not all that long. And even in that time, the way rock and roll people were treated by sort of I don't even want to call them establishment, previous generation music people, this rock and roll thing is going to go away in 2 seconds. They'll all grow up and listen to Perry Como, that kind of thing. When they get to college, they'll listen to light jazz. So Dave Brubeck is waiting, this kind of thing. So, and they both knew that. They were constantly asked, it's like, say, the Beatles were later, what are you going to do when this is over? As if it will very soon will be, Nobody could imagine it lasting. And they weren't so sure because they were smart. So one of the things they both wanted to do, they both of them, now Don would turn out to be very interested in production in the studio and this kind of thing. But at the time, this was a Phil and Buddy thing in New York. I mean, Buddy was talking about opening his own studio in Lubbock and that kind of thing. He said, we can take charge of this. We can produce what we want. We can do songs for people. We can do other people. And that can be a continuing adult kind of job if this all goes to hell. And they started to do that. They produced a record on a handsome young sort of teenage idol kind of singer named Lou Giordano. One side was written by Buddy. The other side was written by Phil. On the fast one, there's what sounds like a chorus of girls behind them doing hi, don't you know? And that is actually Buddy and Phil doing falsetto on the record. Yeah, that's the one time you can hear that, if you know that's what it is. And they had further plans to do that. And then the call comes, and plane crash, your buddy's gone. And they went to Don never went to any funeral. He couldn't stand the thought of watching somebody put away, and Phil and their mother Margaret went to the funeral. They were there. He was supposed to be a pallbearer. And when push came to shove, he was sitting with the family and with Maria Elena Hawley and Sonny Curtis, who was about to become a cricketer, having worked with Buddy before. They were all there. And he said, I couldn't stand it. I couldn't watch him put in the ground. So he was not a pallbearer. They left. They left. They sang one gospel hymn over it and got out of there. But in between, they had introduced Buddy to the Bryants, the same as Buddy kept trying to get a song placed with them. And the late Holly's song, Raining in My Heart, is a song by Felice and Ludlow Bryant, which came of, hey, we don't want this one, maybe you want this one. And Buddy came here and went through the catalog and said, that's pretty good. So that's where that came from. And there were other get-togethers at the Bryants' house. The stories of them out on the lake where the Bryants lived, not far from here, and brought a bunch of girls and were like rafting in the lake. That would be the Holly and Phil and Don. So there was a personal relationship there besides a musical one, which was built on admiration, basically. There are several stories about Buddy, who I think people don't realize what a big guy he was. He was like tall and, it's like, he was lanky, but football player kind of. It's not like he looked so delicate with the glasses and on the, that big windmill arm didn't come from no place. But, there's a couple of stories, Buddy, if you listen to like Every Day and Devoted to You, you would think, well, these are very angelic, innocent guys. In real life, these were rock and roll guys and maybe not all that innocent. And there's stories of, Phil would just laugh about it years later. He said, Buddy would set me up and get me a girl I could go to bed with. And he would have a few. And one day he was having a few and he said, there was a girl there with me. And he said, like, Phil, if I asked you to walk away from her, would you do it? Because I'm your friend. And he said, I had it, damn it. and I did. There's another story that didn't quite make the book, which was a different day. Oh, when they were in Florida. When they were in Florida on that show they did together, there was also a guy came up to them on the beach and thought, they'd maybe looked at his girl for 2 seconds with an eye as she was going by, and the guy wanted to get rough. And Buddy stepped in and decked him. This was, for the Everleys. So there are stories like that. They were regular people and you got to remember the ages they were. We're talking 1958. They're like 21 and 19, and Buddy's like within the same range in JI. So you think of them because I know I talked to Maria Lane about the Buddy and company once, and she said, he was like my young old man. I mean, he just came along so very quickly, as if he knew something, and he'd matured a lot, and he did all this stuff so fast. But he was a kid, and they were kids with a long way to go. When Buddy died, and this is something I was able to talk about with J.I. Allison directly because I'd done some writing about Buddy, and he had gone just before I would have interviewed him again. We were on a first-name basis, but he was gone just before I would have interviewed him again for this book about the long relation with the Everleys. But we had talked about it a little in the course of things, and they were always glad if you talked to them about anything but Buddy. So, because they had these long careers, and they don't know. We recorded with Eric Clapton, by the way. So there's all this stuff they really did, and we talked about that. And he said they started to do sessions with the Everleys within months, and you can start to hear J.I.'s famous tom-tom drum rolls on Everly's records that were hits, and then the Everleys did their first recording outside of Nashville, which was Let It Be Me, with all that almost orchestral backing, and there was like jazz musicians playing R&B parts and all this, and Jerry was on that, and he told me, and I got to tell you, Barry, he said, that really amused me because those last string sessions that Buddy did up there with lavish songs like It's Raining in My Heart and these other things, you'd see them in the movie, they're doing with the orchestra and all this. He said people don't know we were there. And they didn't let us play on them. And now here I am, less than a year later with the Everleys, and we're in New York doing a string section, and I'm on it. She said, I kind of always like that. So that's something people don't generally know. They were then part of the crew that would play a special. They tended to move the same places the Everleys went. So they had moved to Nashville from Texas eventually. They went to Los Angeles like everybody did. And when the Everleys moved to Warner Brothers Records through most of the 60s, they were right in the sessions along with the famous Wrecking Crew people. I mean, Leon Russell and Glenn Campbell might be there, but they're on the same records often. And that went on for years. And one of the great sessions that they ever did during that first years, they went to England. The Crickets went to England as Don and Phil's backing band, unannounced, because if it was announced, they would treat it like two different acts, and they would start to say, "This is Don and Phil's gig. We don't want to step on that." So they were delighted to have this backing. It's some of the best early footage of them. And you look at what that sounded like on British TV, two different shows besides the tour. And it was really clear what they had there. You've got these two close harmony countryish voices in front. And this section, in fact, with electric guitar, one of the great rhythm sessions of that time, including J.I. on drums and all this, and you listen to what this sounds like, and you realize that not only are you looking for the pattern for what's going to be called the Beatles a few years later, I mean, that's the pattern. The Crickets didn't have harmony, that's what it's going to be, pretty much. Country harmonies in front of a hot band, that's just like some of this extraordinary footage that was going on there. And I asked Sonny Curtis, I said, did anybody ever think about keeping it like that? I mean, they didn't announce them. They won't step on it. I said, but look at what you had there. Not only was this really good, but you had Phil and Don and you, Sonny Curtis, and J.I. wrote some songs. You have four songwriters there. I mean, that could have, that band and four songwriters, and it might have been, he said, no, we never even discussed it. I said, the Crickets were just trying to reestablish ourselves, and they were. They had written I fought the law, and the law won that year, which kind of got big for other people, semi-big for them, and you know, in other recordings, like Love's Made a Fool of You, their version. And so he said, we didn't want to mix it all up. You know, we love them. The relationship did not end. Sonny wrote Walk Right Back for them. It was a Sonny Curtis song, which was a top Everly hit. To the end of all of their days here in Nashville, by that point, the reason I would talk, J.I. could know who I was, they were here. They were on the outskirts of town, but they were here. And I had talked to them about what I needed to talk to them about in my job. But, you know, Don would take a break and go out and stay with them on the countryside outside of Nashville for a week. And they told me that they'd gone to the Johnny Cash Museum together, this kind of thing. So the relationship never ended till the end of Phil and Don just a few years ago. All of the people we're talking about, the Beatles, the Hollies, the Stones, all of these people, the Beach Boys, they're no more than a year or two younger than the Everlys, because the Everlys started so young. But the audiences were different. There was this turnover. I mean, the whole Beatles, Mania in 1963, the start of what we tend to call the 60s, which were really sort of 64 to 74, not 60 to 70. The audience changed. I know, I was there. I know how I felt about it in high school, you know, and that's like it. I know how people talked. And the Everlys were not a big part of the thinking. And I've been listening to them when I was 8 years old in the alley in Scranton, PA, when you know, they didn't have a TV. And that was that. So, but at 14 and 15, it's a different story of what you were listening to. And they weren't necessarily part of it then in America, but it was in England. And it had to be incredibly frustrating for them because they're about the same age. And if you think about the people we've talked about that they influence, the Beach Boys could evolve. God knows the Beatles could evolve. Dylan evolved. The Stones evolved. They were given credit for changing. And a lot of, with the Everlys, there was a lot of real resistance for them doing anything. They had very similar interests. They wanted to go to very similar places. They weren't actually intimidated by all that change. They welcomed it because, among other things, instead of being treated like, you know, young hubcap stealers by the musical adults, they were suddenly, these kids just, you know, 2-3 years younger, maybe, start to get treated seriously. And there's this rock press writing about what they do, and none of this was possible to be experienced by them in 1959. It wasn't there. And they were excited about that stuff. But there was a kind of locked-in idea of who they were. I mean, so, you know, nostalgia can be a really good economic boon. When things are slow for you in your Legacy Act, and you're now 60 years old and they want to hear Wake Up Little Susie about your high school experience, and they might have a certain irony about it to you singing it for the 4,000th time. But, you know, nostalgia is a trap too. And there were audiences that allowed, as their music continued to evolve, and some of the best music they ever made was well after the hits. Some of the audience resisted it and some of it said yes. But it certainly wasn't accepted as much as, you know, the change in those 60 stars would be. And that was a difficulty for them. The good news was, with this whole roots music thing, you're a roots music maker. I don't think I have to tell you. It gets hot. It kind of falls off a little. Why are you playing that old kind of stuff? We want new. We want to, and it comes back. It always comes back. So in their time, and these are brothers who sang basically for over 50 years. I mean, basically 1945 to 2005, it's like 60 years with a kind of break in the middle, 60 years. And so they would go about what they did. And I don't think they changed all that much in some ways musically. But the fact is that we just talked about the fall off. Well, when the country rock time came, they're relevant again. And that's not that they changed so much. The audience did. And when 1984 came and Paul McCartney wrote Wings of a Nightingale for them and they're back on the charts, well, you know, in the mid-'80s, this kind of roots pop sound was dominating pop and country at the same time. You could hardly tell it apart again. And the world was ready for them. And they were, in fact, back on the country charts as well as pop. So, you know, I think the way to look at that is the audience came back to them. They didn't have to change all that much.
For some reason, I never realized how early the Everly Brothers were, since they were around before Buddy Holly. Like I didn't know until reading the book. They recorded at the Tulane Hotel where Hank Williams recorded.
This well, we didn't even have a Real Music Row yet. This kind of shocks people, but it's good for the reality of what my project was with the book, with doing Blood Harmony, which was that Don and Phil's first recording you just asked about, which was in the hotel for Columbia Records, and it wasn't so good. They didn't even know they'd done it. They came in there, it all went by so fast that and it was a little off, and it was recorded as a straight country record, a waltz really, and that was 70 years ago this fall. So what people have to understand, there's nobody left alive now from their hit Cadence recordings that followed beginning like 2 years later, 57 to 60, nobody. The last person alive was Ray Edenton, the great guitar player who's added so much to their records. But he was like 96, and I was trying to get to him, and I didn't get an answer and realize why, which is he was dying. And there is no one alive who had anything to do with the Everly Brothers hits at this point. There were people who knew them in the 80s. You know, there were people like, you know, Dave Edmunds just got through this week, just barely. Apparently he's okay. But, you know, you get to, but that's 30 years later. There's only a certain amount of people still alive from the California sessions with the Wrecking Crew. You know, Leon Russell and Glenn Campbell are no longer with us, and few are. You know,
I think that it surprises me because so much of what they did sounded so much more forward than the year that they recorded it.
Well, it was. Because the work was more forward, and it got more and more so. By the time they were in Warner Brothers, they're doing experiments where the engineers are saying, Don is pushing me and pushing me. He's asking for sounds that were very hard to do. So what you really needed was multi-tracking 5 years later, but we're trying to get them now, you know, these elaborate records like Temptation, which was was a Bing Crosby, Mario Lanza number that was like, you know, layers of music. And they were doing things in the studio by 61, 62 that maybe the sessions were messy, but of course that was very studio in the 70s, going on forever. But they were the kind of things that people would be crediting the Beach Boys or the Beatles or Phil Spector for doing, Phil's beginning then maybe. But they weren't working with any of those people. They were trying to do similar stuff, and some of those records do it. We don't just record Lucille from Little Richard. They did it with 7 guitars, one of which was a steel guitar. I mean, all of this was considered weird. Yeah, they was thinking, let's do this. Let's see what that sounds like. I mean, God knows the engineers and producers weren't encouraging this kind of thing, but it's where they were going. And so when it sounds ahead, Kathy's Clown, the biggest single they ever had some of this stuff. I mean, there's a whole story about how it managed to get recorded. There's a story of the song, which is fun, in that their dad, Ike, the famous picker, had just said to them, and they played nothing like Ike whatsoever, which is one of the fun facts, you know, all that great Muhlenberg County picking. They didn't do that. They were slamming chords, you know. They were predicting metal. They were not predicting Ike Everly. But he had told them a story that when he was in high school, he was going out with this girl named Mary, and everybody would say, "There goes Mary's little lamb." So he had this kind of in mind. And Don had a girlfriend in high school named Kathy, and their relationship was nothing whatsoever like that song has been pointed out many times, but he had this name. And then of all things, if you want to know like Don's head at that time and these more complex things, he's thinking of the Grand Canyon Suite, which is a semi-classical piece, and there's a thing in it where there's mules running along a trail, and it goes that had been in a Walt Disney thing. And he's thinking about that rhythm. And he starts the beginning of that song to that rhythm. And there you got Ike's story and Kathy, and they put it together and they clean up the verses, which becomes a great lawsuit later. But how much Phil contributed or different, or didn't. But in any case, that becomes the song. And of course, it was the biggest hit they ever sold. That sold 4 million pretty fast then. And remember, the population of the country was smaller than it is today. It was harder to do that. And when I introduced it on Dick Clark's prime time show, he said, this is an interesting song. It's a little different. It might be not what you're used to hearing, but very successful. And this is what he meant. They were also doing, you'll get this, they were singing in fifths. Now, what am I talking about? The Everly's harmony, which was locked in, perfected, basically easy. Thirds, which is 3 notes up the scale they'd sing from each other, just did it more locked in and beautifully than most people. Fifths, a little harder, a little more, you have to learn how to do it. That's in there. It is, by the way, associated most with what people think of as Beatles chords.
A power chord.
Yeah. And so Kathy's Clown not only has this heavy slam chords, but now they're singing in fifths. And this whole thing is there. And a rhythm derived from the Grand Canyon Suite. And it's a massive hit. And Dick Clark is saying, this is weird, but it's really good, isn't it?
In the book is the first time I've ever heard that there's a drum loop in there. Is this the earliest drum loop?
Well, just about. There is a drum loop in it. They to get the rhythm they wanted and to get it more or less live. They tried it live. I mean, they had very competent drummers, but they couldn't keep up with this rhythm as they wanted with all this stuff going on. So they had bought a machine that was capable of these drum loops, and they worked it out. The engineers worked it out while they were there, locked it in, and there it is. I don't know for a fact that that's the first time a drum loop was ever used, but it may very well be the first time it was ever used on a hit.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it was actually a machine and it wasn't a recording on a tape? I wasn't sure.
Well, it was, yeah, I mean, it was a tape. Yeah. The loop is literally a loop. They set it up so it would go around and around and around, which is how you get this steady, more than human rhythm going. And that's how they locked it in, because it was just hard to do. And I say, this is the kind of thing where the engineers would say, they were challenging us to do things that were so hard. The thing to understand about the Everly brothers, they always say, there's 2 different things here. There's my brother Donald, there's my brother Philip, and there's this thing called the Everly brothers. And people who got this idea that sometimes they hated each other, I don't believe spending a whole lot of time in their lives and how it went. A lot of it things people hadn't heard about. They're in the book, but they hadn't heard about. I don't think they ever hated each other as brothers, as individuals. But there was times where they just came where they couldn't stand the Everly brothers, which is a construction. It's an act. It's a thing you have to do over and over. And as we've just been saying, maybe couldn't evolve very much according to the pressures of the labels, the audience, And they had very different sensibilities from the beginning. So, I mean, they even got to be political differences, but that's not the important thing at the moment. The important thing is their personal sensibilities were very different. Phil was a kind of preservationist. He had an uncanny ability to lock in and lock it down. He was always a good collaborator. He worked well with other people, but he was a follower in the group, not the leader. He's the extrovert, but he's the follower. Don, now he's absolutely the lead singer in the group. He wrote more hit songs. But he's basically a guy who went back to a hotel room, liked to paint, and wanted to be left alone after a show. And he had a few friends. He didn't suffer fools gladly, and he found a lot of them. So he's the outgoing leader in this Everly Brothers thing, and he's an introvert. So right away, they're 2 different guys. They were always different. When the success came, well, it was one thing. It was easy to be more or less on the same page when everything was working. You didn't have to change much, What do you got? What do you got? Let's do this, But when it came time to catch a breath, I call it the trying time in the book, which is this time when the people who were acolytes went on and had hits, and it was got to be a question, what is this thing we're doing? Well, they never stopped getting booked, but they'd be booked one week in Caesar's Palace, and the next week at the Fillmore, and another week at the Hollywood Bowl, and then they're at the Troubadour, and it's like, what is this? Well, they both didn't mind that singer-songwriter part of it when it got to be that. And lucky for that, it was kind of lucky it got to be that. But, Don was very at home with the counterculture and being at the Fillmore and all of the things that went with that. And Phil, not so much. He was like, the same kind of things we've been doing. When they split up in 73, Phil's records are very much in the pop area for the most part, till the very end of that stretch. He did 4 records. There was one that was even disco. Whereas Don, while he was doing that complicated production thing at first in Los Angeles, he came back here. He kind of gave up on that. When he didn't make the money, they didn't love him so much. And in 75, he came back here to a very different Nashville, where now he's friends with John Prine and Townes Van Zandt. And he found some country people, he could get along with very well. Whereas I wasn't a good old boy, and I never was, and I couldn't do that stuff. But in fact, his best record at that time was a traditional country record, a modern but traditional country record of his time. He'd tell people, I want you to think of me as a modern country singer. Forget I was ever an Everly Brother. Forget the country rock. And he's on tour with Roy Acuff again, So, and he was. But when they got back together, there was a lot of things. There was a lot of personal things to settle, not musical, because once they got back together musically, I think the most important thing to understand about what this took, falling apart and getting back together, which is something people haven't talked about. It's something that I feel like I found in the course of this book, and it's the central story, which is that when they had these falling outs people hear about, and that could come down to like Phil punching Don out in the studio, or getting off a bus, and the band, when the banders would watch them literally physically fighting outside and then coming back in. The thing that sparked this was almost always throwing off the harmony. Don had felt so constricted about the fact that they always had to do this thing, and as lead singer especially, So what if there wasn't a harmony singer? He re-recorded some of the songs solo to show you maybe it always could have been that way, And he wanted to sing his way. And even when they were together, he started to get into these more improvisational, yeah, kind of stuff between lines, and it got to be harder and harder for Phil to follow. And when they would really get in trouble with each other is when it was impossible for Phil to follow. Now, think about that. Years and years later, when they were getting back together, Phil would say, close harmony is the perfect expression of love. My and your friend, Sean, who wrote with them, he said that to. He said that to several people. Now think about it. Sean Camp, who he wrote songs with, he said that to a couple of people, but Sean related that back to me. And if you feel that way, that's very personal. Is that about, if that's your perfect expression of love and your brother keeps breaking it, is that personal or is that the act? The answer is yes. It is both of those. And the relationship of that thing is kind of the centerpiece of the story I have to tell. Because we all know people whose personal lives and the act's lives intermingle. But I've never had one where they're so closely related to this. So it's a biography. I need to tell their story. I need to tell the act's story and the music. And they're both there. And I don't think you can do it without having a handle on both.
3 years ago, I remember you telling me you had started working on this.
3.5 now.
3.5 now. That is quite the undertaking. I remember us talking about it and you agreeing, yes, this is quite...
Could have been longer, yeah.
And what do you feel now that you're on the other side of it?
Well, you always get exhausted. It's hard work, as people find out when they try to do a book. You know, people sometimes very cavalierly say, "We're going to write our own book. This is going to be about, musicians. It's going to be about my career. We have all the anecdotes." And then they start, and it's like, "Oh, I didn't know it was going to be like this," And so yeah. But I've done that. I'm used to it. It's what I do. And I gave myself a deadline. I'm not getting any younger myself now. And I probably, that 3-year thing, I gave myself a deadline like that because I was afraid it would go longer. I can't handle these. My friend Peter Goralnik, who does these 10-year books, I'd be afraid I'd never get done. I can't give myself that much leeway. I need a deadline. and so that was a given. And it started in the first place suddenly. You should know. I mean, when I was telling you I'm going to be doing this thing, virtually all the writers of pop music history had asked the same question, which is, why the heck isn't there a serious book on the Everleys, which gives you the sources, gives you the inside story, gets it down right? Of the 10 original members of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, they were the only ones without that. And if you like, it's Elvis, there's among others, Chuck Berry. I mean, how many books are there? endless, and including Peter Goralnik's massive epic, and there wasn't one on them. And everybody said, why isn't there? I was online with my friend, Elijah Wald, who people now know. He's written a dozen books. Now they know he's the guy who wrote the Dylan Goes Electric book, which did very well for him, boy. But he was on there saying, why the heck isn't there a real book on the Everleys? And I started to talk to him about it and toss it around. And I was somewhat dubious that people would say yes to it, financially, not because they mattered. Well, it turned out my literary agent caught this conversation, and he said, why don't you do it? And it stunned me. I've been listening to them since I was 8. Played them on the radio when I was in college radio in 1970. Had interviewed Phil at the Country Hall here in 2008. Anyway, 8 or 9. And I said, well, why don't I? And I put together the kind of proposal you need, which is the point where I was talking to you and told you well in advance. I said, I'm doing this thing. And it was the fastest sell of a book I ever had. So 2 weeks later, I have a contract, get on it. Here we are, and it's out.
Be careful what you...
Be careful what you wish for. Listen, it was exciting to me. Book projects are exciting to me. Like writing a song is to you. When you're finding it, when there's stuff you don't know, and I know I don't know it, and it keeps getting more and more interesting, and the characters in it get more and more complex. And, people who think this is the story of 2 smiling rock gods with ducktails are going to find out who they really were. They're that. Some of the stories are true, but there's a lot more to this story than that.